The classic era of The Simpsons has so many clever, creative moments of humor to choose from. So choosing just one to stand out from the rest took some work, and yet I chose. Here's why I believe Homer's phone call from season 7, episode 17, titled Homer the Smithers, is the funniest scene of them all. In this episode, Homer replaces Smithers as Mr. Burns' assistant while Smithers goes on vacation. When Homer messes things up with Burns, Burns learns to do things without him, so much so that when Smithers gets back, Burns realizes that he doesn't really need him either. It's established early on that Burns is not on good terms with his mother, so the scheme for Smithers to get Burns to feel like he needs him again is for him to dial Mr. Burns' mother and, with Homer's help, transfer the call to Mr. Burns, so that when his mom inevitably starts giving him a hard time, Smithers can cut into the call and tell her off, thus earning favor with his boss once again. So, let's go through the call. First of all, we know that Mr. Burns, being 104 years old, is very old. So the improbability of him having a mother who's still alive and well gives us our first layer of humor.
Hello, Mrs. Burns. This is Waylon Smithers. I have your son Montgomery on the line.
That improvident lackwit. Always too busy striding about his atom mill to call his own mother. I'll give him what for's till he cries brassifrax.
Next, we have Homer disconnecting the call when he should have transferred it. Smithers says,
Perfect. When I give the signal, you transfer the call to Mr. Burns.
Homer says,
I'm transferring a call into you, Mr. Burns.
No problemo.
and he still doesn't know to press transfer and instead disconnects the call. If he slipped and pressed disconnect, it wouldn't have been as funny, but we get a good bit of visual humor where we linger on the blinking light next to one of the buttons on the phone before Homer nevertheless goes and presses the wrong one. A major form of humor with slapstick comedies like The Simpsons involves incompetence. That's an important thing to remember with this whole bit. So now we have Homer improvising by pretending to be Mrs. Burns to Mr. Burns.
Hello, Mr. Burns. This is your mother.
He's imitating the voice of someone he's never met, thinking it'll work. Aside from the improbability of living to Mrs. Burns' age, nobody that age should have a voice that's this high-pitched. This shouldn't work, right?
Oh, hello, mater. Sorry about pulling the plug on you and all. Who could have known you'd pull through and live for another 5 decades? Oh, is my face red?
But it does. The show throws us a curveball by having Mr. Burns actually believe that this is his mom on the line. Homer already did something dumb by pressing the wrong button, so we're made to expect another dumb move. His ridiculous impersonation won't work. But the fact that it does adds another layer of improbability. And the fact that Mr. Burns can be fooled by this impersonation adds some incompetence on his part.
Mrs. Burns is 122 years old, so try to sound more desiccated. And she doesn't call her son Mr. Burns.
Smithers tells Homer to make his voice sound more like what a 122-year-old would actually sound like. And he reminds Homer not to call Mr. Burns Mr. Burns, because that's not something Burns' mother, or any mother, would do. And this is all that Smithers says. So here's what Homer does.
Son, this is Mrs. Burns. I just called to say I don't love you.
He fails both pieces of Smithers' advice at once. He thinks the solution to this mistake of calling Mr. Burns Mr. is to call himself Mrs., when no mother would introduce themselves to their son that way. Homer should know that. So this is another layer of incompetence. And his impersonation gets worse this time. It bounces between raspy and clear. So that's another layer of incompetence. And Homer's way of addressing Mr. Burns proves that after all this time, he doesn't know his boss's first name. Is it common for adult employees to not know their boss's first name, by the way? So this adds yet another layer of incompetence. Whether we realize it on a conscious level or not, the escalation of Homer's easily avoidable blunders is what makes us laugh at all this. Now, listen to this line.
You are a bad son, Montel.
So,
Montel. This is close to Mr. Burns' first name, Montgomery or Monty, but not only is it not his name, but Montel brings to mind 90s daytime talk show host Montel Williams, whose show was on at the time, or perhaps recording artist Montel Jordan, which would be another contemporary reference. For those who caught it, it makes for a funny reference. In the end, Burns realizes what's going on and Homer gets caught. This whole scene is no longer than 2 minutes, so to me it's all the more outstanding for being able to pack this much ingenuity in such a short time. Now let's watch that whole thing one more time.
Okay, I got you covered.
Mr. Burns may have mastered 2,799 of my 2,800 duties, but I'll wager dollars to donuts he still can't handle a call from his mother.
You're on.
What?
Hello, Mrs. Burns. This is Waylon Smithers. I have your son Montgomery on the line.
That improvident lackwit. Always too busy striding about his atom mill to call his own mother. I'll give him what for's till he cries brassafrax.
Perfect. When I give the signal, you transfer the call to Mr. Burns. After she tears into him, I'll rush in and save the day.
Got it. I'm transferring a call into you, Mr. Burns.
no problemo.
Uh-oh.
Ahoy, ahoy. Hoy.
Hello, Mr. Burns. This is your mother.
No. Gah. Oh, hello, mater. Sorry about pulling the plug on you and all. Who could have known you'd pull through and live for another 5 decades? Oh, is my face red?
Mrs. Burns is 122 years old, so try to sound more desiccated. And she doesn't call her son Mr. Burns.
Son, this is Mrs. Burns. I just called to say I don't love you. You are a bad son, Montel.
So, impersonate my mother, will you? And you, Smithers, you must have put him up to it. I'm glad I fired you.
You really blew it this time, Smithers.
Ah!